Good to see everyone. We'll be starting in a minute or so. Stay tuned, and we will be kicking off momentarily. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. I will give a quick intro of myself and what the survey is about. If you have any questions, definitely write them down or post them in chat, and we will answer them at the end. So to start off, I'm John Gottfried. I am the co-founder of Major League Hacking. I'm based up in New York, and before MLH, I worked as a developer evangelist at Twilio and a software engineer at a handful of different companies. So I've been in many of your shoes before, and that definitely has informed a lot of the work that we do here at MLH. So before we dive into the data itself, I'd love to talk a little bit about methodology. Every year, MLH works with about 150,000 developers in our community. These are people that attend in-person and virtual events, and engage with us on a variety of different platforms. They are the primary respondents of this survey, but we also do publish it in public places so that we can get responses from people who are not just our participants. Much of our data, we're able to compare, MLH participants versus a general population. What this results in is approximately 4,500 verified responses. We filter out a lot of responses for people who didn't finish the entire survey, or for people who have indicated for one reason or another that they might not be reading the questions. They might just be clicking through. We do our best to filter all of those people out so that we have accurate, high quality data to share with you. That filters out a little over half of all of the responses we get so that we can get to the best possible result here. This is the first year that we are releasing data from this survey. We've actually been conducting a version of this survey for 6 or 7 years at this point. And over time, we'll be releasing more historical and comparative data, based on what you all think and what the general response is to the report that we put out here. So let's dive in a little bit to some of the demographics. I covered some of this in broad strokes, but these are the people who are in the MLH community and who are answering this survey. The vast majority of them are students, a little over 50%. We do have some people who have graduated and gone into industry, and some folks who have graduated and are still trying to make their way into industry, but the bulk of our audience and survey respondents are students. Most of them come from North America, US and Canada, though India is a ever-growing population in the student developer community. Of the students who respond, it's largely undergraduates, so people in 2 to 4 year colleges who are studying for their first degree in most cases. About 63% of them are studying computer science or engineering. That's kind of a notable fact, because you would assume that of a population of programmers, it would actually be a lot higher than that. That's reflective of a lot of the intentional efforts that both MLH and a lot of our campus chapters make to bring in people from outside of the traditional CS classroom. You see a lot of people from other disciplines utilizing programming and going to programming events to supplement their other education, whether that could be a STEM field like physics or math, or even something like a liberal arts major. The vast majority of people here are looking for jobs. That may sound obvious, but a lot of the students in our community are just beginning their careers and starting off their search for internships or full-time jobs. So we're going to cover a handful of different topics in this webinar here. Obviously, we talked a little bit about the methodology and demographics, but we're going to be diving into a lot of the learnings that we've taken out of this survey. For your context, this survey is something on the order of 100 questions. It takes 30 to 45 minutes to complete. It's very in-depth. We've combed through it and picked out the pieces that we felt were most relevant and interesting to a DevRel and educator audience here. But certainly, if you have any questions at the end, we would love to dig in further, because there's probably data that we have that wasn't included in the overall report. And we'll go over both the general technology trends that we've seen, as well as more specific platform trends. If you find something particularly interesting, I would encourage you to take a screenshot and tweet about it. We're totally fine with you sharing this data publicly and talking about it in other circles, whether it's in DevRel Slack, social media, or even internally at your companies. All right, without further ado, we are going to dive in to some of our learnings. So the first and most important topic I always like to cover when I think about early career developers is how and why they're learning in a particular way. When we think about what people learn in the classroom, a lot of it is foundational theory and academic discipline of computer science. Things like how algorithms work, basic programming concepts like variables and loops, concepts like computational efficiency. A lot of curriculum tends to lag behind industry in the applicability of the topics that people are learning in class. So you may learn how to make a bubble sort, but you might not learn how to build a modern web application, for example. Obviously, that's a broad generalization, but it is backed up very strongly by the data that we see self-reported from students. 91% of respondents say that they gain skills at a hackathon that they are not getting in a classroom. It's rare for students to participate in things in an extracurricular format that they are learning from, right? Like usually when we think about student activities, they're mostly participating in social activities outside of class. Hackathons and developer community events are unique in that they are an extracurricular educational mechanism for a lot of students. When you think about how that actually applies to someone's job search, about 29% that their skills have directly helped them get a job, and 61% believe that it will in future. This is highly correlated to where they are at in their career search. Obviously, if you haven't yet gotten a job, you wouldn't see that crossover yet. When we think about technology trends, we'll touch on this a little bit more later, but students do tend to gravitate towards bleeding edge technologies, things like AI development, Web3 development, open source communities. But most of them don't get exposed to those concepts in class, and many of them lack the experience or even support mechanisms to get started with them. So going to these events where you can experience industry mentorship, peer mentorship, and not have the risk of being directly graded gives people the opportunity to level up and build their skills in a safer, more accessible way. When we broaden this scope, right? So we talked about, people learning skills outside of the classroom. We also like to look at where they're actually learning outside of the classroom. Obviously, a huge portion of our community is learning through hackathons, but the journey of developer in 2023 is very multifaceted. People are learning to code through classroom lectures, online resources, self-driven project work, certifications, and events. we structured this question in such a way so it really is supposed to represent where people first learn to code, but we see this trend carry on into many more advanced subjects. Someone might go to a hackathon, try out some kind of AI tool for the first time, then go take an online course afterwards to develop a mastery. And so developers really do have to leverage many different types of content and many different educational channels to hone their skills. This is true regardless of where people go to school. It doesn't matter if you're going to community college or MIT, you're still being forced to leverage a lot of different channels to level up your skills. This tends to be present in professional communities as well, though we don't have quite as much data around that. But there's certainly reports that talk about how many different ways people utilize to learn technical skills. As mentioned in the previous slide, when we think about specific areas that people want to learn new skills in, people are definitely drawn towards popular industry domains. One of the interesting things here is that the industry domains that people are excited to learn about are often a direct reflection of where they see career prospects at any given point in time. So things like business intelligence, logistics, fintech are often reflective of where students see job opportunities and opportunities to advance themselves, many of which they've learned about through their connections to industry professionals at events. To hammer the point home, 41 of respondents do say that the content they're learning in courses is relevant, but not sufficient enough to meet their goals. So students are very self-reflective of both the benefits and the gaps in their educational experiences. So on our next slide, we're going to be diving into some data that we did not release in the PDF report yet. If you've not downloaded that PDF report, we can send out a link at the end of the talk here, but we'll be covering some additional data in this webinar that was not featured there. I always like to make this a little bit more engaging, so we're going to have a question that you can answer in chat here. I'm curious if anyone can guess what the top 2 languages that people want to work with over the next year are. So you can see the bottom 4 here, but what are the top 2 languages that people want to learn over the next year? I would love it if people share their guesses in chat. And we can tell you the data in just a second here. While you're guessing, I'll talk a little bit about the stat on the left side here. So one of the big trends in CS education over the last handful of years has been bringing on more modern programming tools. Python has been the most prominent of them. It's incredibly accessible. There's great. Java continues to be a leading language in a lot of classrooms, as does C and C++, though a lot of schools are phasing them out in favor of more modern languages like Python or even JavaScript. I see we have a hand raised here. Would you mind posting your question in chat there, and we'll be able to answer it asynchronously? Or I can just talk to it. I think that's Mariah. All right. Okay, so
I think chat's disabled at the moment.
oh,
I'll work to get it up, but
sorry about that, folks.
Folks want to vocalize for now.
Okay, I just enabled chat for everyone. So if you have your guesses, throw it in there. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Thank you, Vadim. All right. Okay. If anyone has guesses, feel free to post those in chat. Sorry about that, Mariah and Vadim. Great. Okay. Python, TypeScript, Rust, Python. So JavaScript or C++. Okay. Good guesses all around. Remember, these are languages that students want to learn in the coming year. So number 1, this is going to be, I think, a little counterintuitive for folks. Julia language is the number 1 language that students want to learn in the next year. What we've seen is that data science is becoming a massively growing area of interest for students. And as they start tinkering with a lot of the more modern tools, perhaps something like Python, maybe even R, Julia is often a natural extension of that and allows them to expand their skills in a new area. And so it's become incredibly popular as a future area of interest for a lot of students. The second language, which a lot of you guessed in chat, was Rust. I think we all know how popular Rust is becoming. It's really nice to have a type-safe language that can do really advanced scripting type work. We're seeing students become really interested in it. This is also very much related to the Web3 kind of trend that's going on in the industry right now. A lot of students look to things like Web3 as areas of opportunity for their careers. And learning something like Rust often allows them to work in those ecosystems in a way that they can't with just Python. Similar to Solidity, which is down there at number 6. So moving on, the next topic that we always like to talk about here is brand preference. One of the conversations that I frequently have with developer relations team is about the long tail value of working with developers early in their careers. It is true that someone that you teach a technology to in college is not going to become a big enterprise customer in the next 2 or 3 years. However, there is a stickiness factor to the tools that you learn when you are starting out that carries on for a very, very long time. Developers love to use tools that they're familiar with and that they like. And we see that with students, they often learn a tool in class or at a hackathon and bring it with them into the industry many, many years later. About almost 40% here of students have introduced the technology they learned at a hackathon into work. That means in a commercial environment. That time frame is not immediate, but it still provides a lot of that long tail value. And when we think about how you sort of structure a developer relations strategy to focus on both short-term and long-term gains, one of the big questions you always have to ask is, where do our future customers come from? How do we make sure that we're not just generating leads, but actually building a system that wins developers' hearts and minds in a way that can compound over time? And working with developers at community events, early in the career is a way that pays dividends for many years. This also carries over into career prospects. Unsurprisingly, if you encounter a company at a hackathon or a community event, you are significantly more likely to feel connected to them and want to work there than if you just saw their name on a website or a job board. 74% of respondents say that they're more likely to apply for a job or internship at a company they encountered at a hackathon. This is true of other professional events as well, but for students, hackathons are their main chance to interact with people from industry. These preferences. Next, we have a slide that also was not part of the report about some of the barriers that developers might face when learning new technical skills. So when we think about developers holistically, yeah, we'll share the recording later, Crystal. So when we think about developers holistically, I touched on some of these stats earlier, but there's a lot of counterintuitive barriers that early career developers face. Some of this stuff might seem obvious. If you have a boring teacher or imposter syndrome, you might struggle to learn new skills. One of the things that is kind of counterintuitive is a lack of motivation or focus. When we think about students, certainly it's easy to picture highly motivated, engaged students. A lot of people really struggle to take that first step. You don't know what you don't know, and looking at something like a new technical skill can feel incredibly daunting, and it can be incredibly difficult for people to build the initial motivation and impetus to go out and try something new outside of their comfort zone. And so community events, especially things like hackathons or workshops, can help people get over that initial hump of not feeling motivated or feeling, kind of confused or scared of where to start. Additionally, engaging content and curriculum makes a massive difference in people's ability to learn new technical skills. Um, one of the things that we see frequently is that people might struggle with a concept in a course uh, because it's presented in a dry way that they cannot generalize to a use case that they understand. And then once they get to implement it in production, whether that's at an internship or a hackathon project, it suddenly clicks for them, getting them over that barrier of ineffective instruction or lack of access to quality teaching, um, which is a really interesting kind of barrier that a lot of students face. And a lot of that's not due to malintent, but rather just lack of experience with industry tools and teaching methodologies. In terms of where you learn and practice coding skills, we touched on how multifaceted this is for most students earlier, but working on personal projects is one of the most practical ways people develop their skills today. Obviously, they engage with things like school or online courses, but personal projects and hackathons give people an environment where they get to take all of these theoretical concepts that they might see or hear about or understand at an abstract level and put them into practice on a problem that they intimately understand and came up with on their own. Some food for thought is how can your DevRel team support project-based learning? When we think about developer relations activities, a lot of it revolves around documentation, onboarding flows, workshops, conference talks, tutorials, blog posts, all of these different pieces of content and community engagement. What I found when I was at Twilio, and often what we find in MLH's work at hackathons, is that getting people excited about building a project with your tool, even if it is a throwaway project, can make them that much more excited to work on it again in future and gain them a much deeper level of understanding for your platform or tools than they ever would have by just reading something without immediately using it. So, there are programs out there that can, encourage developers to build projects, but things like highlighting, developer side projects, writing about them, featuring them, working with them on live streams. There's a lot of different ways to encourage this kind of behavior, and it leads to really efficient, in-depth learning about your platform. All right, here's one where I would encourage you all to take a screenshot because these stats are meaty, and we'll be covering more of them on the next slide as well. We do a lot of industry benchmarking at MLH around what technologies students gravitate towards and what technologies they're excited about trying in the future. Some of this is reflective of the partners that we bring to our events as sponsors. Some of it is reflective of general industry trends and affinities. So, for example, MongoDB and Cockroach are both MLH partners. They tend to outperform where they would land if they had not been MLH partners based on our comparative data. Additionally, we see a lot of really bleeding edge stuff like Cassandra or even Snowflakes or Databricks getting a lot of interest from students about using it in the future, even if they have no experience using it today. Something like Databricks or Snowflake can feel very enterprisey, but once people learn about it, that it often gets the gears turning about how they might be able to try it out and use it in the future. And so I would say that when you're thinking about developer community events, it's really, really important not just to look at who is already using your technology, which is obviously a great reflection of how engaged and active your customer base is, but also how excited are people to try it in the future on other projects when the need arises. And that's where that brand awareness and stickiness really comes into play, because you need people to know you exist. You need them to know what you do in order to even consider leveraging it in future projects. And that's often what conference talks and hackathons create for a developer community. When we think about deploying, now this is a really interesting one, and there's a lot of nuance to these numbers about AWS versus Google Cloud versus Azure. AWS in a wider industry context has something like 50 or 60% market share when you ask the average developer. In the MLH community, it's a lot more spread out because a lot of these other partners like Google Cloud and Microsoft have been incredibly active engaging with students and have been able to have a really meaningful impact through their work with MLH on shifting that brand perception amongst a pretty big cohort of developers. And so, there are notable differences among different cohorts of people that you survey around their affinities for different tools and how excited they are to use them. We see these trends continue when we talk about other developer tools and frameworks. Obviously, there's a lot of different various tools here. This is a multi-select question where people get to answer for each particular technology, whether they've used it in the current year or want to use it next year. Some interesting stats to pull out here. So something like OpenShift and Terraform, a lot of excitement about trying them out in the future. Most students have no opportunity to try anything like that in their coursework, but once they learn about it, they are really motivated to dig deeper and try it in future. Something like Docker does have a pretty strong market share. Almost 50% of students have tried it in the last year, but even more want to try it in the next year if they haven't yet. Some stuff that's a little bit counterintuitive. Flutter, gaining a lot of popularity right now, not a ton of adoption on campus. You see sort of a lagging indicator here, where as technologies become more popular, students are often the first to learn about them, but that can take a year or so for them to get up to speed and change their answer to this question of whether they've used it so far. In terms of operating systems, we still see a lot of early career developers on Windows. I know that if you talk to the average software engineer at a startup, they may not be excited about that fact, but it is true. And frankly, Windows has drastically improved their support for obviously Linux subsystem and also other developer tools that make them incredibly competitive to something like Linux or Mac as a developer environment. And so we've actually seen a lot of students moving back from something like Mac to Windows for both cost reasons and also accessibility reasons of installing modern developer environments. And so I think another example where the pattern in industry, where everyone at a startup works on a MacBook, not necessarily present in higher education. Lastly, we dig a little bit into deployment tools and coding environments here. Obviously, there's a lot of talk recently about things like GitHub code spaces. Replit and Glitch have certainly been having a really successful run of it. A lot of what you see here, and that's a typo there, that's Netlify. A lot of what you see here is reflective of a specific focus on engaging developers at all stages of their journey. So something like Replit has had a free plan for students for quite a long time. GitHub has their education pack, which MLH brings to our events. Something like Netlify has done a lot of education-specific campaigns trying to engage people building their first website. And so you do see a disproportionate sort of like preference for platforms that have reached out to these audiences specifically. Some stuff that's a little bit counterintuitive. Sneak here is a cybersecurity assessment platform, so it helps you identify vulnerabilities in your code. They did a particular promotion at hackathons where we ran a capture the flag cybersecurity challenge for them that gained them a lot of awareness among students. Same goes for Circle CI, which has been making a shift towards more enterprise offerings, but went to campus with MLH to get some of that early career adoption and is now seeing the results of that work. When we see lagging indicators here, a lot of it has to do with community momentum. So something like Bitbucket or GitLab versus GitHub. GitHub has had a ton of success working with professors to integrate into curriculum and bring offers to students. That's given them a disproportionate market share around up-and-coming developers. And so that's really a reflection of the hard work there. When we talk about chat platforms and community platforms, many of you may already know this because I actually know a lot of developer platform communities exist on Discord now, but about 70% of folks say they use Discord in the last year. Only 16% use something like Slack. This is really interesting when you start to think about like external versus internal communities. Uh, Slack has a connotation of being a corporate platform. It's really good at that purpose, right? Many of your companies probably use Slack or Teams for your internal communication. It doesn't have the same level of fun or engaging or publicly accessible features that something like Discord does, which is why so many developer communities, and especially student communities, have gravitated towards Discord. The other key reason that we've seen here is that Discord is something that people use both for fun and work. It's not uncommon for people to be in a Discord server with their friends and then hop over to a Discord server for a developer framework that they're using, which makes it multi-purpose in a way that Slack typically isn't, especially for folks who are entering the industry. So the food for thought that we'll leave you with on this slide is there content and what can that content look like to help developers achieve their learning goals and make this something that's sticky for developers early in their learning journeys so that you can gain that kind of market share that something like GitHub or Replit has, where people could be using this for the next decade, even if they only have a couple of small touch points with you while they're in school. This is a question that I've talked to a lot of developer relations folks about recently. It looks like we might have a minor formatting issue here, but basically, we care a lot about people's preferences getting back in person after the pandemic. Obviously, the pandemic is not entirely over, but there are enough mitigations in place where it's much safer to gather now than it was 2 or 3 years ago. For all of your context, before 2020, MLH was an entirely in-person community. We did about 1,200 in-person events in 2019, which went to basically zero in the latter half of 2020. So we, like many of you, learned how to adapt to a virtual format. And now we're working on a more hybrid approach where we have both virtual and in-person offerings. And so we care a lot about making it a safe and comfortable environment for people to return in person. There is still a lot of hesitancy about going to in-person events. Even though conferences have resumed and gained a lot of momentum in the last couple of years, a lot of people are unsure about going to these events and really want to make sure that they still see COVID prevention efforts in place at these events. Even things that might still seem like they're not the mainstream trends anymore, like having hand sanitizer available or PPE available, does make people more comfortable to attend in-person events. Requiring things like masking or vaccinations, or even just having a policy that's publicly documented, really can just assuage people's concerns and make them feel like the organizers care about this as a concern of organizing their events. Beyond that, we have seen changes in event sizes. We still see a lot of large events and those drawing a lot of developers, but we've seen a lot of mid-size events gaining prominence, partially because they cater to a smaller, more intimate audience and potentially can make people a lot more comfortable. Alrighty, this is a return to topics that we touched on in the previous slide. So this is kind of an interesting one. Obviously, AI is having a moment. There's a lot of really impressive work going on in large language models and different AI and GPT, platforms. So of course, that's something that students are excited about. Beyond AI, we see people getting really, really interested in open source work. For students, open source is one of the primary ways that they can build real world technical skills on an existing code base and do it in a way that they can leverage as a resume piece or a portfolio piece. And so we do see a lot of students doing things like open source fellowships, Hacktoberfest, or even just going to good first issues on GitHub or GitLab to get their toes in the water in open source. We also see a lot of people gravitating towards beginner-friendly events because it makes them more comfortable, makes them feel like there will be support mechanisms in place to support people at all stages of their technical journey. And we still see a lot of people interested in Web3. I know that it's one of those fields that has kind of, had hype phases go up and down. From a purely technical standpoint, a lot of students see it as a land of opportunity where they can make outsized technical impact and have massive career opportunities very, very early in their time in industry. And we do see that playing out for people who learn those skills and get involved in that world. Lastly here, cybersecurity, very quickly growing field. People do recognize the need there. Every article a student reads about a new breach or cybersecurity issue makes them realize there's opportunity there from a career perspective. And game development is one of those things that just brings a lot of people into tech. Often people's first touch point with programming these days is modding games or getting involved in game development themselves. When we think about organizing events, there's a couple of other interesting pieces of data that we like to share. People register for events anywhere from a couple weeks to a couple of months out. It's actually pretty rare these days for people to register last minute. And it's pretty rare for people to register way far in advance because they may not know what their schedules are. And so that 3 to 8 week window is where the bulk of people register for events. This is true of hackathons. It's also true of a lot of conferences that we see. For hackathons specifically, one interesting thing is that there's a huge variance in when people decide who they will be working with at the event. For any of you who have been to a hackathon before, you know that the whole format revolves around building a project with your teammates. We do see a lot of people, probably 70-something%, who do plan in advance, but there's still a lot of people that show up at the hackathon and figure out who they're going to be working with as soon as they arrive. This is an interesting opportunity from a DevRel perspective because it means that people might not be fully locked in or decided to a particular project or technology or prompt before they arrive. And so it does give you opportunities to get them excited about your platform and to bring them in on it in a way that they might not otherwise experience. And so we're really excited about, hackathons as a vehicle for introducing people to technologies. So I know that's a ton of data. We will be sharing details from this presentation afterwards. We have both the recording and the slides for everyone. I saw a couple of questions in chat, but I'm also going to open the floor now to additional questions. Thank you all for listening. I hope this is valuable, and I hope you'll continue to read the report and share it with your teams. We have a lot more data where that came from. As I mentioned, this is just a small selection. So, the thing I would love to hear from you, beyond filling out the feedback survey here for our webinar, is if there's any data that you would like to see from future reports. So, I will answer Vadem's question first. Is quantum computing on NLH's radar at all? So this is an interesting one. We do see a lot of people in our community who are really interested in quantum computing. What we believe the solution is here is a 101 level approach, because unless you're studying a physics or math degree with a focus in quantum computing, it's incredibly unlikely that you've been exposed to it in class or in an academic environment. And so in order to introduce people to technology, they need hands-on projects where they get to see how and where quantum computing is applied to make an impact. We have programs like the fellowship where people can spend 12 weeks deep diving on a particular technical subject. And that has been an effective way for people to learn more complex subjects. I also think that if you brought this to focused hackathon and ran a workshop, that people might be really excited to learn the basics, but a longer engagement like a 12-week fellowship is significantly more likely to get people to actually follow through and build their first quantum application. Happy to talk more about what we've seen there and what we think could work there, but I think there's definitely interest, just not a lot of exposure is really the short answer of it. Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions, feel free to raise a hand or post them in the Q&A tab or chat, and I would be happy to answer them. If you have questions that deserve follow-up, we're happy to send you additional data afterwards as well. If anyone has thoughts about other data they'd like to see, feel free to post that in chat or in the webinar feedback survey. We would certainly love to hear it, and we have a lot more to share that we didn't include. I'll put that share link back up. Any other questions, comments, things you'd like us to dig into here? Awesome. Well, thank you all. Oh, here's one from Crystal. So, this is a great one. Is there any interest in opportunities related to hardware or computer engineering? This is a great question. So, as I mentioned earlier, only something like 60, I think it's 63% of participants are computer science majors. We see a lot of people coming in with either electrical, hardware, or computer engineering backgrounds to hackathons. But in addition to that, one of the offerings that a lot of hackathons have that people get really excited about is what we call the hardware lab, which is basically a loaner library of devices. Things like Arduinos, Raspberry Pis, breadboards that they can tinker with and potentially do their first hardware project ever. And we've seen a lot of people where that introduction to building a hackathon project with hardware builds a lifelong interest in that discipline and can often get them to even change majors or really focus on hardware as a technical specialization going forward. So I definitely think there's interest. I definitely think that, it's an access issue more than anything else. Like, if you are in a computer science program, you probably just don't get a lot of exposure to hardware. It can be expensive to get started. And so most students don't get a chance to try it. Having a hardware lab at things like hackathons is a really strong introduction that doesn't cost students anything because it's free. And I would like to see more of that. So if you're interested in that, I'd love to talk more. But I think there's a lot of opportunities to get more students excited about hardware and expose them to bleeding edge devices. So thank you. Great question. Maybe we can get some stuff like robots too. I don't know. Any other questions while we're still here? I really appreciate the engagement so far. Great questions. All right. Well, thank you all again. If anyone wants to reach out, I'm John at mlh.io. We would love your feedback on the webinar forum here, hackp.ac/webinar feedback. And we will be sending out the recording and slides afterwards. If you enjoyed this, and perhaps you work in the Web3 space or you're just Web3 curious, we're going to be doing our next webinar on August 22nd about how to build a thriving Web3 developer community. We believe really strongly that there's interesting technical work to be done here, and a lot of that revolves around developer communities. And so we're really excited to talk more about what we've seen among early career developers and what a lot of industry professionals are doing to build thriving developer communities in the space. So thank you again. I hope you all enjoyed this and learned a lot. Stay tuned for our follow-up resources, and I hope we'll see you again soon. And feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions.